Okay, I will try and restrict myself to 10 minutes. I'm going to say something which has some points of commonality with what Anne has just said, but also I think some quite strong disagreements. So this will reflect the kind of heterogeneity of the kind of approaches that we may have taken in this project. I am going to talk about this for 10 minutes or so, about, contrary to what Anne has just said, about the absence in a lot of the research and literature on digital natives or social media use, which seems to me to be absent of some very basic phenomenological ideas about the embodiment of the person and the nature of the real. So we'll come to, maybe we can talk about this after. But before I do that, I just want to say, I'll delay my introduction for a second, just to say this. When I was looking at reviews of Professor Bauman's last book but one, it's hard to keep up, I think, but it's 2011, it's called Liquid Surveillance, with David Lyon. I found a review of his book which said the following, on thecrankysociologist.com. This whole formation of hierarchy of relationships by any medium is getting old and tiresome, as Anne has largely just argued. There is no reason to assume a priori that face-to-face interactions are more authentic or deeper than digital ones. I happen to disagree with this statement and some of the things that Anne has said, and want to present a kind of perhaps a different way of thinking about this, which has risen out of my analysis of the research so far. Quote here from Berger and Luckman. In the face-to-face situation, the other is fully real. This reality is part of the overall reality of everyday life, and as such is massive and compelling. To be sure, another may be real to me without my having encountered him face-to-face. Nevertheless, he becomes real to me in the fullest sense of the word only when I meet him face-to-face. Indeed, it may be argued that the other in the face-to-face situation is more real to me than I am myself. One of the most, I think, influential accounts of the intersubjective and embodied dimensions of culture. So we're going to these thoughts have come to me really as a result of what I think has been missing from a number of the analyses of the social media use. So here's what I'm going to talk about very quickly. In terms of drilling down into the data, as David mentioned, I have subjected most of the interviews to a fairly long-winded and time-consuming process of grounded theorising, working up categories, eventually trying to work up some concepts which seem to hold across a critical mass of the interviews, and I've identified about 3 so far, which I won't talk about now because there's no time. What I really want to talk about is the kinds of issues and ideas which, looking at this data, has stimulated me to think about. These being philosophical, anthropological, sociological work in the areas of intersubjective intercommunication, definitions of culture as intersubjectively achieved and maintained by us in our everyday lives, and that this intersubjective creation, maintenance and activation of culture in one anthropological definition is something that requires the presence of embodied persons. So we can see the differences here, and I'll also at the end of this time say something about where I would like to go next. Here's what I have kind of, I found these, looking at, so these are my categories that I am looking at so far. The first is anchoring, which I will talk about briefly. The second is the notion of cocoon communities, which I will also talk about briefly. And the third is a much more complicated and difficult issue, as Anne has just very clearly stated. The key question seems to me now to be what is happening in the interaction. If I start to think of real, unreal, online, offline as a kind of much more of a singular, for digital natives, a much more singular and unified realm of experience than being a kind of dichotomized either or. And my interest now is in trying to think more about and perhaps look for some kind of empirical evidence of, because these things are easy to say. What is being imported into the face-to-face social from the modes of interaction and self-representation and self-understanding that we find online. Anchoring, as Agnieszka said a few moments ago, comes across very, very clearly. I call it anchoring. There's an excuse to put up a picture of a boat, but one of the primary uses of Facebook is clearly, among our sample, to psychologically, emotionally, and perhaps culturally anchor themselves in their place of origin or what they think of as their home culture. This anchoring through repetitive daily use, often focused on the minutiae of experience. This is what I've just been doing, what are you doing now? This kind of trying to keep in touch at this kind of very close, detailed, intersubjective level, is something which clearly allows people, the kinds of young people that we have been looking at, to range across the world, seeking new and interesting sorts of experiences. So that's a very clear use of Facebook that we found. The second is, I would suggest that our data would support an emerging idea in community studies, which Dervin and Korpala in Finland, Fred Dervin and Murray, have put on the table recently, about the idea of cocoon communities being, well, really a new conceptualization of some of the kinds of mobile, multicultural, diasporic communities that are sprung up for short periods of time in this diasporized world. Two things to say about this. One is, it's argued it's social media and Facebook clearly strongly facilitates the formation of such communities. These communities, I think there are two important things to say about them. One is that, as Dervin defines them, they are unbinding and temporary, but deeply significant and meaningful for those who belong to them. And the second thing is that in these kind of global diasporic conditions, and the second is that Facebook especially, and the formation of the kind of loose cocoon communities, by definition, makes it possible to live, let us say, in a situation like international students in Poland, with really very minimal interaction with the kind of local cultural ecology or people. So cocoon community, I think, sort of fits, as an emerging theoretical concept, sort of fits, I would say, the description of the kinds of things that we're finding in the data. And so anybody who might have been under the impression that a 3-month or 6-month or 9-month or 2-year even sojourn, let us say in Poland, for educational purposes, would involve some form of significant intercultural experience of Poland itself, is barking up the wrong tree, I would say. And the third thing, this is the hardest thing to talk about, but I'll try to get through it quickly, which is, and I'm not even really sure what I mean by this, but what I perceive, so this is my, I've got 2 minutes left and I've only introduced what I'm doing, so is some kinds of drastic, potentially drastic, and we'll find all kinds of problems with this, but reduction or simplification of face-to-face modes of interlocution and interaction. And why is all of this? What am I going to say? If I hadn't spoken so long about the introduction, I would look at this. I was going to say something, this is all in the paper. First of all, we need to since we're looking at negotiating cultural difference, we really need to think about what we define as culture. I have proceeded from a definition drawn from social and cultural anthropology, cultural studies to some extent, some kind of branches of sociology, as culture as an processual, enacted, day-to-day, interactive, and intersubjective kind of matter, which we don't have time to talk about here. But the central role in all of this is, in my thinking, is embodied intersubjectivity as a way of getting to all of that. Good old C.H. Cooley, a proto-American sociologist, we don't have time to think about what he said, that would be in the book. What I think, the idea that comes from him, that symbolic interactionism, many other kind of schools of thought have taken up since, that we achieve selfhood, that we come to know ourselves and come to define ourselves and experience ourselves through an ongoing, everyday process of intersubjective mirroring of others. That we come to understand and see and understand ourselves through the eyes of others as an ongoing kind of project of the self. Now, I'm interested in the streams of kind of analysis which also state or argue that this ongoing process has to be phenomenologically framed and embodied. Something which, contrary to what Anne has just kind of, I've said that already 4 times, I'm sorry. Okay, so that's that. I argue in my paper that we should think of culture as processual more than thing-like, not reducible to properties of individuals, but rather as intersubjectively co-created and maintained by embodied agents in the kind of way that I've sort of thought about that. And some things, there are a couple of consequences to this view, or this line of reasoning. One is that cultural activity, according to that definition of culture, or those definitions of culture, requires that somebody be there as an embodied fleshly subject. What seems as well, in my argument, to be a consequence, is that negotiating cultural difference is a complex and dynamic activity which social media may facilitate, clearly facilitate, but in themselves likely reduced to more purely cognitive forms of communication and representational forms of expression. Okay, so I'll finish. Just wanted to show a picture of a monkey, because it's always good to show pictures of monkeys, I think, especially if they're holding bananas. I just would want to make this one point very quickly, if I may, which is that it's quite interesting that neuroscience, even the emerging science of neurosociology, I understand, is beginning, whether we want it to or not, or need it to or not, to validate a lot of the things that I've been talking about that emerge from the humanities and the social sciences, with the emergence of mirror neurons, the idea that when two beings, two embodied corporeal beings come together, there is a kind of very intensive mirroring. If you haven't kept up with the discussion about mirror neurons, it's not hard to find, that the establishment of empathy, the beginning of, the beginnings of self-awareness in relation to others and awareness of others, seems to have some kind of clear neurological basis, as good old Cooley said it did 100 years ago. And I think one of the things that I want to kind of get into more now is look at, for all the problems of the kind of potential reductiveness of neuroscientific explanations of cultural phenomena, the kind of idea of neurosociology, because seems to be mounting evidence that the presence, the physical presence in close proximity to an other, is a very core element of cultural evolution, of the establishment of relations between people. And this is all connected as well, I think, between nobody said the N-word today, not the N-word, the other N-word, narcissism. The so-called narcissism epidemic, which is being written about in a very florid way in the popular media, but which is also underpinned, I think, by some very serious and solid social anthropological, social psychological research. Okay, well, some pictures and I'll finish. They've actually discovered that when two people are playing charades, if you follow this, I don't know, when two people are playing charades, the neurological activity in their brains very closely mirrors, but they kind of merge. Social brain, cultural evolution, and all of that. I don't know if we really need this stuff, but I think it's quite stimulating to think about. If I want to have a conclusion, it goes without saying, and to me, for the future, this for me is really the important question now. I think a few of us have alluded to it. Professor Baumann did. I watch my own 13-year-old, the digital native, and she clearly does not distinguish between being online and being offline. It's all the same to her. It's merged. I think we need to learn more about this, and we need to know, for my own interests, what is being brought into the offline social interactions from the on. That's way too pessimistic to talk about now. But in the third thing, I'm also interested in, if you look at Sherry Turkle, her work, her two books, from utopian optimism about the online life in the 90s to her deep disquiet now, we see her making an argument that as part of social media and online life are implicated in a process whereby people are becoming increasingly seen as things. Professor Baumann himself has, in much of his work, alluded to made the argument that in liquid modern conditions, people are increasingly beginning to self-represent and be seen as commodities. Since Heidegger has been mentioned, let's finish with him again. Another look at his contention, if I understand it correctly, that nihilism is really, in one key definition, the gradual extension over the face of the earth of everything on it being turned into an exploitable resource, including us. I want to go in a more kind of philosophical direction with some of this, but really, in an empirical sense, try to think of a way of looking at how online, offline manifests itself in the practices, behaviours, habits of flesh and blood, or embodied beings. if we can use that. So, thank you for your attention.